U.S. Supreme Court in all of this? Where is the U.S. Supreme Court? Well, unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court has aided and abetted the rise of mass incarceration in the United States. The court has eviscerated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, granting to the police license to stop, interrogate, search, frisk just about anyone, anywhere, without a shred of evidence of criminal activity, as long as they get consent. Now, what's consent? Consent is when a police officer walks up to a kid on the street, one hand on his gun, and he says, "Son, you put your hands up in the air and let me see if you got anything on you." Kid says, That's consent. And according to the U.S. Supreme Court, you no longer have any Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. The police don't have to have a shred of evidence of criminal activity that happen. Now, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court knows that very few people will ever dare refuse consent to a police officer and say, "No, officer, you may not search me. No, officer, I'm not answering your questions. No, officer, I'm going to keep walking on this sidewalk and not stop when you tell me to stop." Most people don't dare to refuse consent. But if you are one of the bold and courageous few and you say, "No, officer, you may not search me. I'd not give my consent," ultimately it's your word against the police officers in a court of law about what was said on that sidewalk or on the side of that freeway, effectively granting the police license to stop and search just about anybody, anywhere. The New York Police Department recently released data showing that in 1 year alone, 2010, its police officers stopped and frisked 600,000 people in 1 year. More than 85% of those stops and frisks were of African Americans and Latinos. And only 15% of those stops and frisks were related to any sort of suspect description or investigation into a crime. Hundreds of thousands of people stopped, frisked, often thrown to the pavement routinely. Now, this, of course, doesn't happen on college campuses. These kinds of tactics don't occur in middle-class white neighborhoods, by and large. No, where this is done is in the one place they came from, which is in poor communities of color, in the hood. But try to challenge this practice in a court of law. You can't. Not anymore. In a series of cases beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing. The Supreme Court has ruled that it doesn't matter how overwhelming the statistical evidence is. It doesn't matter how severe the racial disparities are. Unless you can offer proof of conscious, intentional bias, tantamount to an admission, you can't even state a claim for racial bias in the criminal justice system today. Now, as a practical matter, that puts race discrimination in the criminal justice system off the table. Most police officers know better than to say, "Well, yeah, Your Honor, the reason I stopped him was because he was black." Most police officers know better than that. Most prosecutors know better than to say, "Well, I would have given him a better plea deal, and, I would have bargained it down to a misdemeanor rather than a felony, but, he's from the hood, he's black." No. Most law enforcement officials, like the rest of us, know better than to say our racial biases out loud. But more importantly, so many of the stereotypes and biases that drive law enforcement decision-making today operate on such an unconscious level that many officers couldn't even admit to themselves their bias if they tried. An officer who's actually trying to do right, driving down the neighborhood, sees a group of young black kids walking down the street, their hands are sagging a little bit up down. That officer trying to do right in that community may think, let me jump out and check them, see what they're up to, make sure they don't have anything on them. And all of a sudden, those kids have their arms up, those young people have their arms up, stop, frisk. That same officer, driving down the street, watching a group of young white kids walking down the street in their neighborhood, never even occurred to them. Jump out of the car, stop, frisk them, question them, see what they're up to. Now, that officer may not mean those black kids any harm. He may just be trying to do his job. But those unconscious as well as conscious biases and stereotypes play out thousands, hundreds of thousands of times per year, adding up to enormous racial disparities in the system. And the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled we can't even challenge those disparities in a court of law. Those racial profiling cases that I was bringing 10 years ago can't even be filed today. It's all over. In this way, the U.S. Supreme Court has immunized the criminal justice system from judicial scrutiny for racial bias, much in the same way that it once rallied to the defense of slavery and Jim Crow in their day. But being rallied and corralled into prison for relatively minor crimes and drug offenses is just the beginning. Just the beginning of one's odyssey. Once you've been put behind bars and stamped with that felony label, your punishment, lifelong punishment, begins. You may be released. You might even just get, if you're lucky, felony probation for some crime. But when you're released, you enter into a parallel social universe in which all of the basic civil and human rights other folks take for granted no longer apply to you. Consider some of the rules and laws that govern the lives of felons today, and ask yourself if they remind you of a bygone era. The first most obvious is denial of the right to vote. 48 states and the District of Columbia deny prisoners the right to vote, and in my experience, most Americans kind of treat that with a shrug of their shoulders, like, well, they're in prison, why should they be able to vote? Well, in many other Western democracies, prisoners do have the right to vote. And in fact, in some of them, there's actually voting drives in prison. The idea that, you made a mistake, you broke a law, and you're no longer one of us, you're no longer a citizen, your voice no longer counts, doesn't exist in many other Western democracies. But here in the United States, we seem to take democracy a little less seriously, and we not only deny folks the right to vote while they're in prison, but we routinely strip people of the right to vote for months, years, in some states for your entire life upon release. Nationwide, nearly 1 in 7 black men have been temporarily or permanently disenfranchised as a result of felon disenfranchisement. Then there's jury service. One hallmark of the old Jim Crow system, of course, were the all-white juries, particularly in the South. Well, today, in many parts of the country, all-white juries have been having a roaring comeback. Why? Because if you've been convicted of a felony, you're deemed ineligible for jury service for the rest of your life. And then, if you've ever had a negative experience with law enforcement, you could be struck from a jury for cause. Good luck finding many folks of color, particularly in poor communities, who have not yet had a negative experience with law enforcement that would justify their exclusion from a jury for cause. Then there's employment discrimination. You're released from prison, the first thing you want to do is figure out, how do I get a job? Released from prison, for the rest of your life, you've got to check that box on employment applications, asking the dreaded question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? It doesn't matter if that felony happened a few weeks ago, a few months ago, or 35 years ago. For the rest of your life, you've got to check that box, knowing the odds are sky high and your application's going straight to the trash. Research has actually shown that white men with a criminal record have a better chance of getting a job than a black man without a criminal record, with equal qualifications. But a black man with a criminal record is the most disadvantaged applicant in